So, Christina, it's such a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you. The tables are turned, Guy, because before I had you on my podcast, and now here I am.
Well, I was hugely honored to be on your podcast, and everybody should know that I'm quite nervous or slightly nervous because Christina is a published author twice, but has also reviewed many books for the Sunday Times, was a columnist for The Independent. She's a well-known feature of the UK journalism world. And so I feel like I'm talking to the real deal, whereas I'm just an imposter here.
Yeah, just an imposter, Guy. Let's get this straight. I'm extremely famous and you're a nobody. So.
And I also feel like it was interesting. So for your interest, for the listeners' interest, I was looking for somebody because William Green was busy writing his book, as he should have been doing anyway, but I felt like I wanted some writing mentors, and so I reached out to a college friend who's also a well-known feature of the journalism world, Camilla Cavendish, to say, Camilla, could you help me to find somebody who could mentor me in my writing? I need some kind of editor or something. And she introduced me to Christina. Now it turns out that Christina hasn't even met, or no, you have met her, but you're not in a close relationship with her. Or you're not professional colleagues, I guess.
No, we're not professional colleagues. So, I mean, she has a much higher profile than I have ever had, and also ended up, as you know, at Downing Street, which I certainly haven't done, and I'm extremely unlikely to do, particularly with the political direction that this country has taken in recent years. But I respect Camilla enormously. I've read her journalism for years. The way we did meet was actually when we were on the Today programme to talk about nursing, I think, many years ago, and I did, in fact, once bump into her at Westminster Tube and introduced myself. But we've known of each other for years, but not actually known each other.
And I guess it turned out pretty quickly, just for the listeners' interest, that so Christina is an extraordinarily good writer, but is not either in the skills that she's developed or in the interest that she's developed. There wasn't a close, good interaction when it came to editing my writing. But I, through that, read Christina's books, read her writing, and became fascinated by who she is as a person. And I have, Christina, enormous respect for you. In the little review that I wrote, I called you a badass.
I think that's probably the biggest compliment I've ever had.
Well, and for your interest, and I hope it'll come out, I think that Christina has been extremely courageous in her writing. I think you've been extremely courageous, Christina, because you've written in a way that I feel like I can identify as being, you've written the truth as you see it about yourself, and you've been courageous enough to say, I'll let these cards fall where they fall. And I don't know many people who write in that way. I don't know if you want to comment.
Well, I'm obviously extremely honoured by your words and observation. I don't know that I just feel I write in the way that it's my instinct to write, and that's probably all I can say about that.
So this is her book for anybody who's interested, which kind of is the reason for this. And I think, Christina, what you would say is that your first book was what you felt like your editor wanted you to write, but this is the book that you actually wanted to write. Perhaps you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to write both of them. All my life, I wanted, from my 20s actually, when my life went very badly wrong, or at least more wrong than it had gone wrong before, I did think about, even though I was in no position to, I thought about writing a book to help people when life went wrong. Not exactly a self-help book, but a kind of, here's some consolation to get you through the days kind of book. So I flirted with a book like that, well, almost 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago now, and I didn't write it. And so in fact, when my then agent, after I left The Independent, we were kind of, I'd wanted to write the memoir for years, and I'll get onto that in a moment. But when we were talking about things that I could write while working on the memoir, we both came up through a conversation with this idea of writing a book essentially about how we cope when life goes wrong. And it wasn't intended to be exactly a self-help book. I've read masses of self-help books, and at one point in my life was quite addicted to them. I think I can happily say that probably none of them have helped me in any way that I can remember. I found them a bit like chocolate or cake or crisps. You kind of gulp them down and think, well, that was delicious, on to the next one, and can't remember anything about them at all. And what I wanted to do was a journalistic inquiry into how people in very difficult situations have coped when life has gone wrong, which it does for all of us, woven together with my own experiences of life going wrong. And the most recent and painful example at the time I wrote that book was losing my job and my career, which for me meant, it sounds terrible to say more than anything, because obviously, there's my family and we'll get on to my family, but it was what I had put my time, energy, investment really into my whole adult life, being a journalist, and that it felt as if that was taken away from me in kind of one moment, and that was pretty agonizing. So that was the hook for the first book, and I did love writing it, and it's actually sold much better than the second book, and I still get letters and emails from people who read it now. But the second book, you're absolutely right, Guy, a version of that is the book I'd wanted to write all my life, which was essentially to tell the story of my family. And when I first started thinking about that, the story was very different, because everybody was still alive. And then in the process of by the time I actually sat down to write it in this version, I did write a version of it before, everybody was dead apart from me. So obviously a lot had changed. But you're right, this was the kind of heart book, the story of my sister's mental illness, of my family, of my beloved parents, who were really extraordinary people in many ways, and of our family life going from a kind of relatively cosmopolitan international background to suburban Surrey, and trips to National Trust houses. And then the toll that mental and physical illness took, certainly on Caroline, and actually in many ways on all of us. So yes, this is the book I've wanted to write all my life.
And I guess, you might be listening in your car, or you might be listening to this as you doze off to sleep. So for those of you who don't know Christina and who haven't read both books, I should give Christina a chance just to give a kind of a very brief summary. I will just set it up. And say that, so Christina has had, I think, one comes up with the idea of Job, if those of us who are interested in biblical stories, in that you can't imagine the number of things, and is it the very worst? No, she wasn't locked up in a concentration camp or in the Gulag for 30 years, but some pretty extraordinarily difficult things happened, and it's a pleasure to meet you now when life seems to be in a very, very good place. But maybe you can just sort of tell the very brief story for somebody, because it'll set up many of the other things that we talk about. You probably have rehearsed this many times, so forgive me for asking you to do it again.
No, not at all. Actually, I don't ever go around giving a litany of what has gone wrong in my life. And if I went into it in detail, it could take quite a while. So I won't. But
I'll set it up, and then you'll finish it.
Okay.
So Christina's mother and father met in Germany, and her father was a career diplomat, and the first place they lived was in Thailand.
That's
although
right.
I believe you were born in Rome.
They lived in Bangkok and then in Rome.
Bangkok and then Rome, but you were born in
Rome.
And it was an idyllic diplobrat, I would argue, lifestyle, and with every expectation of everything good that people would want in life, with two amazingly qualified parents who weren't alcoholics or had the best things going for them. And why don't you take the story from there, if that's okay?
Well, I have to say, I've never heard the word or phrase diplobrat. I can't think of any people less qualified to be called brats than my parents. So you're absolutely right that the life they lived, to me now, seems unbelievably glamorous. And my mother was very young. She was 21 when she married my father. She was 23 when, she was 22 when they went out to Bangkok, and she was 23 when she had my sister, Caroline. But yes, it did look from the photos like a very glamorous life. And my mother wore beautiful Thai silk dresses made in kind of Dior designs by a dressmaker. And they went from a bedsit in Earl's Court where they shared a bathroom and kitchen with the other people with bedsits in the house, to a house in Bangkok with 5 servants and a white grand piano and a huge garden. So yes, everything set up for what might seem like an idyllic life, and they were very much in love with each other. My father was extremely handsome, and my mother had this kind of transition from ugly duckling. She was a very scholarly and exceptionally tall teenager, Swedish, and not particularly beautiful as a teenager. I think what happened for her was her father died when she was 12, and she adored him, and her mother, who was a kind of perfectly nice woman, but there was not that soul connection really. I think my mother lost her luster when her father died, and I think when my father fell in love with her, she got that luster back, and you can almost see it in the photos, and she really bloomed and blossomed, and they were this very glamorous young couple. And my sister was born, and then my brother, and then I. But my sister, on the journey back, and unbelievably in those days, it was on an ocean liner from Bangkok to a home posting or going back to the UK. My sister was not allowed to eat with my parents, and she screamed all the time she was separated from my parents. And my mother's theory was, well, my mother said she was never the same again. And from the age of, I think, 18 months or 2, she was very difficult. She had tantrums a lot. And the reason that my parents abandoned the diplomatic life was because they thought she wouldn't cope with it and moving around the world, and that she needed stability. And so they bought, by mail order, because you didn't leap on a plane in those days, a house on a housing estate in Guildford in Surrey. And that's where I moved when I was 9 months old, and where my mother lived till she died, which is now 6 years ago. So they went from this glamorous life to, a kind of ordinary suburban life. We went to the local state schools. My father commuted into London every day. He worked in the civil service rather than the diplomatic service. And I suppose the shadow that was cast over our family was my sister being a very difficult child. And then when she was 14, she went off to stay with a family in Norway, came back, and as far as my brother and I could tell, just disappeared. And it turned out she'd gone to the adolescent unit of a psychiatric hospital and had suffered what her GP called a nervous breakdown. And some years later, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So that really, I would say, was the tragedy at the heart of our family. And one could argue, of course, we can never know these things, but one could argue that almost everything that followed came from there. I developed very severe acne. Well, first of all, I went to a youth club in order to meet boys and found God, apparently, and that didn't work out very well. And then I developed very severe acne, and then I developed debilitating pains in my knees, and kind of one thing after another. And I suspect that a number of those things are linked to my relationship with my sister and her illness. But obviously, we can't do control experiments, so I don't know.
Yeah, and So I just to go back to your first book and really the second book, I think that something that I connect with is that one of the problems with the crisps of the self-help books is that they're really just telling you what to do in their view, and they have some potted theory which has some bearing on reality, and usually the author does not reveal much about themselves. And I think that what's really special about both your books is that you open the kimono and you reveal an enormous amount about yourself, and with how you struggled with the consequences of what happened, or the things that happened. And that is a far more real and helpful way to tell a story, because you're the protagonist in the story, and somebody who's looking for help can now say, this is what this person, Christina Patterson, did, and this is what happened to her. So maybe what happened to me is not so bad, and I can try out what she did. And it seems to me that there's very little of that literature around, actually.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly no shortage of what you might unkindly call misery memoir. So I hope that my book is not entirely a misery memoir. I hope there's a bit of joy and even some humour in it as well, or in both of them. But I think, I mean, I wouldn't want to tell anyone what to do to mend their life. And in the first book, what I did was talk to lots of people and kind of gathered together the information and pretty much said, this is what these people did. You know, no one can tell you what will work for you, but here it is. Here's the information. This is how people got out of the pit they were in when, for example, some friends of my parents lost both their sons, one when he was a toddler and one when he was in his 20s. You know, how do you get over that? And they are still wonderful people, and they still laugh and smile in spite of the absolute abject tragedy they've been through. You know, they can't say to anyone, this is what you do. I can't say to anyone, this is what you do. All any of us can say is, I went through this and here I am. And I do think that there is, if you are able to communicate and if you have learnt how to write, because of course writing is a craft and you can't just say what comes into your head and it will be fine. You know, there is a mediating process, which is the craft of putting together words in the right order, in the right rhythm, in a way that, in my view, in a way that, as Orwell said, is a window pane that kind of offers that clear line between thought and feeling and the reader's experience. If you are able to do that, then I do think there is that power that you've talked about in really kind of being witnessed and being a witness in a way. And I think there's something incredibly powerful about being heard and about having your voice heard. And for the reader, if you have been through something that somebody writes about, particularly if it's something associated with shame, there can be a catharsis in that, because very often we think we are the only ones who suffer in the way we suffer. But one thing you discover through art and literature is that we all suffer. And actually, the ways we suffer are very often more similar than we think.
But in order to get there, you have to be courageous enough to confront your own suffering and to talk about it in a way that's relatable. And I think that's extraordinarily courageous. I admire it in the few times that I've seen it. And I think that, I guess you get rewards from it because now people connect to you in ways that they might not have otherwise connected. But somebody who I hope maybe will listen to these words and maybe will connect with you is Brené Brown, who's written about the importance of making yourself vulnerable. And I don't know if you've connected with her writing
I know.
at all.
Funnily enough, I obviously know who Brené Brown is, and I know about her work on vulnerability. I haven't read any of her books, actually. And I'm sure it has been enormously important. I do have to admit that I am slightly wary of people making... I mean, I understand it's her work and she's made it her life's work, and I have no doubt that it has helped many, many people. But I am personally slightly nervous of picking one thing and making it the lens through which to see the world. I mean, the unkind word for that, which I wouldn't apply to Brené Brown, but I would apply, for example, to some business gurus, is you have a shtick. And, for example, you hit on an idea which perhaps could be a column in a newspaper, and you think, you know what, I think this could make a really good book, online course, business program, something that can, become a kind of, you're a guru, basically. The world is full of gurus. Yeah. And I don't think Brené Brown is a guru because she's a scholar. But I am wary of people who look at the world through one particular prism and say, if you too look at the world through this prism, you will discover all these riches. And I just think, yeah, sure you will, but you will if you look at it through the other 65,000 prisms as well. So, and
two things come up for me, and it's really hard because you can only follow one because conversations are a linear thing. But, in writing, so William Green has a quote from somebody that came up a lot when we were collaborating on my book, that I won't remember who it is, but maybe it'll come out in the notes. Life is all confusion and something, and writing is about removing all of that. And I think that something that is slightly frustrating is that when you want to tell a story of something that happened or describe something that you see, there's such enormous complexity in what one sees, but one has to distill it down
exactly
to a few relevant things. But the reality is far more complex than that.
Exactly, absolutely.
And in a certain way, I guess, and help me once I've tried to describe it, is that is just a function of the way writing is, right? Writing goes on a page and it's linear. But your point is, don't make your life into, life is more complex than that. And
exactly.
don't present yourself to the world as being just about that one thing.
Exactly. I mean, we all tell ourselves the way we are meaning-making creatures, and one of the things that makes our lives bearable is the stories we tell ourselves, although obviously we can tell ourselves terrible stories as well, and self-destructive stories and stories that limit or even destroy our lives. But for example, in the business world now, everybody talks about purpose. And I think, fine, absolutely. Obviously, we would all rather wake up in the morning and earn our living by doing something we believe is not completely useless. But even purpose is a story we tell ourselves. Everything, in a way, is a story we tell ourselves. And in as far as kind of my aspirations to be a guru are concerned, the only thing I've got enthusiastic about is the idea of a book about doubt, because I think that would be really interesting. I was unfortunately told there would be no market for it, which is a shame, because I think doubt is very much more interesting than the false clarity we are offered at every corner. And, if you think of, for example, Keats, who's one of my heroes, he talks about negative capability, which is the ability, in one of his letters, which is the ability to be in uncertainty, mystery and doubt. And I think absolutely, if I have a philosophy of life, that's it, the ability to be in uncertainty, mystery and doubt. Yeah. And the other words of his that I use almost as a kind of life motto is from his poem Ode on a Grecian Urn, when he says, "Beauty is truth, truth is beauty, that is all you know on earth and all you need to know." And I think, that's it, truth and beauty, that will do me.
Again, multiple things come up for me. Just for the listeners' interest, Christina, now I need to get this right, I ran
the Poetry Society.
Right, for a period of time.
But 3 years, yeah.
Yeah, and so through that, Christina's met all sorts of great people, including Salman Rushdie.
Yeah, I mean, I met lots of people through my South Bank days, actually, because before that I worked at the South Bank Centre. And looking back, met most of the greats of 20th century literature, or at least the ones who were still alive in the 1990s.
I'm slightly envious. I'm very envious of that. But and I haven't read nearly as much poetry as you have. But I think that one of the things that I tell my children is that if you can live in uncertainty and doubt and make yourself comfortable with that, you might likely to live a bigger, more successful, more fulfilled life. But there's a huge desire in humans to go for the certainty.
Absolutely. And me too. That's why I used to be addicted to self-help books. I mean, I remember when I was running the Poetry Society, which was in Covent Garden, I would get the bus home from the Charing Cross Road, and I would find myself inexorably drawn to foils under the self-help section and snap up another self-help book. And I treated it like kind of fantasy fiction or something. I didn't take it particularly seriously. But for example, for those intractable areas of one's life, I think if you're a reader, you will kind of want to read everything that's written about that thing in the hope that you will somehow find the secret formula that will solve the problem.
What's funny is that, so I used to live on 67th Street and Columbus, and no longer, but there was a Barnes & Noble there. And I was a regular visitor to the self-help section of that Barnes & Noble. And I was looking for formulae. And actually in my book, I talk about it a little bit because I think I found some very, very useful things.
And by the way, I loved your book. I said it on my podcast, but I really loved your book.
I think there's a commonality there in that I had the courage to write about some of my worst career moments.
Absolutely.
And you had the courage to write about some of the worst points in your life. And that's not what most people do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you talk in particular about, I can't remember the name of the company you worked for where it all went horribly wrong. Yeah. And your honesty there was just breathtaking and extremely unusual for somebody in kind of finance and the business world.
Well, I knew where I was when I wrote that, and where I was actually in the bedroom that I kind of spent a significant part of my life growing up in. It's a small room in the south of France. And when I realized that I was going to use that chapter, And come what may, it's that idea of I'm going to, the truth shall set you free. But and Jordan Peterson evokes all sorts of negative reactions from people, but he has said something that stayed with me, which is, if you want to have an adventure, tell the truth, which is a fascinating idea. So listener, I'm not going to, listener, you think that this is for you, but this is actually a selfish conversation for me to ask Christina a whole bunch of questions. So there's a certain amount of background that I can give, but I'm now, if you want to get the full background on the questions I'm going to ask you, you're just going to have to go read her book. But I want to talk about growing up with a Swedish mother and a English father, and somewhere in one of I've printed out only the last 100 of the articles that Christina's written in The Guardian, the Daily Mail, the Independent, and this is just 100 out of about 800. But somewhere there you write that you regret having learned your mother's mother tongue. So I have thoughts about that, but I want to hear you talk about it first.
Yeah. Well, by the way, very touchingly, Guy, you've taken over from my mother as the only person who's read my entire oeuvre practically, or a fraction of it. She was the only one who read everything. And I've always been very bad at documenting things, and she died in 2016. But up until 2016, I have a full filed accounts of my journalism, which I haven't had at all since. Yes, it is a big regret of mine, and we've talked about this before, that I don't speak fluent Swedish. And the reason my mother didn't bring us up to be Swedish, I think it was a number of things. The one she gave us was that my brother and sister were already speaking Italian and English because they were living in Rome when they moved to the UK. They forgot they lost their Italian pretty much overnight when they came here. And when my mother tried to speak Swedish as well, they started stumbling. 3 languages, for whatever reason, seemed a bit much. But I think there are other reasons as well. And I think one of them is that my sister, this was obviously before we knew she had schizophrenia, or she didn't have schizophrenia then, whatever it was, she just desperately wanted to be the same as everyone else. She didn't want to stand out. She was sort of embarrassed to have an international background. She just wanted to be a conformist, going to the same suburban state school as everyone. So she didn't want to be foreign, and she didn't want to be known as having a foreign mother, and she didn't want to speak a foreign language. But also, these were the days when multiculturalism was not celebrated, and immigrants tried to assimilate, and my mother tried very hard to assimilate. So although we did celebrate certain Swedish traditions, and I do write a bit about those in the book, there was never any doubt that we were a kind of British family, really. I mean, I thought of it as half Scottish and half Swedish because my father was his parents were from Scotland. And so although Mum did speak a bit of Swedish to us, and every summer we went to Sweden and picked up some Swedish, and I taught myself a fair bit as a child and teenager, I never learnt it fluently, and that is a huge regret. And last summer, I spent the whole of June travelling around Sweden on my own, kind of connecting with my mother's country. And I did start learning Swedish again on Duolingo, and it is on my... and for a few months I continued with that. I'm also trying to resurrect the Italian I learnt when I was young, because we have a house in Umbria, and I'm finding it earning a living and keeping up with the news 24/7 in order to do my punditry, and trying to learn Italian and trying to learn Swedish currently, and doing the coaching stuff, which I'm doing. It currently feels a bit much, but I do want to learn Swedish. Yeah.
And I think that one thing that sort of irk is too strong a word, but I don't think you should have a regret, because it wasn't a choice, it seems to me, that you made. And I think I've made this point to you, but I want to make it to the listener. I'm convinced that the following is true, even though I can't prove it. And I think I've read some things. One of the great benefits of not being an academic is that we can issue thoughts without having to kind of like back them up.
Yes.
But I'm sure what I'm about to say rings true to me, and I'm sure it contains a large amount of truth in it. So the reason why we want to learn the mother tongue and speak to our parents in their mother tongue is not because it's a good thing to know Swedish or French or Italian or anything else. it's that we cannot know who our parents truly are unless they express themselves to us in their mother tongue. And there are these fascinating sort of parallels in mine and Christina's life. So my father's mother tongue, well, he spoke German to his parents, but you could say his mother tongue is Hebrew because that's the language he spoke to his friends and his siblings in, and had the majority of his life in until he met my mother. And there's a little bit of Hebrew that we've spoken, but basically we spoke English to each other. And I think that one of the difficulties that I had when I was seeking to make my way in British society is that I had assimilated. In fact, I'd gone to a school in Surrey and I'd lost my South African accent. But you didn't have to dig far below the surface, and there was somebody who had an Israeli father, but who hadn't really fully connected to the Israeliness of his father. And so there's something there about psychological completeness.
Yes.
And I think that what heartens me is that when you say that you spent a summer traveling around Sweden, because ideally you would have had those conversations with your mother, but that's in a way a kind of a healing thing, if you like.
Absolutely. I agree with every word of that, Guy. I think that's so true. And my mother said when she met my father, because when they met, they spoke German to each other because my father didn't speak Swedish and my mother didn't speak English. And then they did both learn each other's language. My father did learn Swedish, impressively actually, and he spoke a number of languages. My mother spoke 5 languages and now has a shockingly monolingual daughter, or largely monolingual. But she did say that when they started speaking English to each other, she felt that she was getting to know him all over again. And I think you're probably absolutely right that you don't really know someone at a soul level unless you speak to them in their mother tongue. And the other thing, which is a bit weird, but so when I went to Sweden, which was obviously a kind of very personal journey, partly following in the footsteps of my family, and I went to the cottage that we used to go to every summer, and I went to the south of Sweden, Skåne, where my grandfather, who died before I was born, and relatives came from. I'd never been there before, and oh my goodness, the landscape, I just thought, this is where I'm from. I felt it at a really primal level. And what I like the English countryside, it's very beautiful, but the Swedish countryside is what hits me here. Really weird. Yeah,
and it's fascinating because it's not as if you grew up there, and how these things transmitted, but that you obviously feel some kind of transmission.
Yes.
And Christina emailed me beforehand and she said she hasn't watched any of this program, The Last Kingdom, which is playing on Netflix right now. It's truly wonderful. It's history of the UK before 1066. And I didn't realize the extraordinary influence that, well, call it Denmark in its greater Denmark, so Sweden, the Norway, the Vikings, there were invasions constantly. And so I'm curious, given that you have far better understanding of Sweden than I do, I realize that especially probably if you go to the east of the UK, then there is a sort of a Danish Scandinavian influence. Do you see that at all?
Well, I'm almost doubt that I know much more about Sweden than you do, because really my knowledge of Sweden was a child's, and it was very unquestioning and unthinking. And I am now trying to learn more about Sweden, and I hope that my next book might, that it might feature more prominently. But I know almost nothing about the Scandinavian influences in this country. I did sort of know that in the East there was more of a bit more of an influence, but I don't know very much about it. I think Rod Liddell wrote in the Sunday Times the other day about how brilliant The Last Kingdom was. Yeah. And I watch almost no telly, and I've just started watching Succession. So when I've got through Succession, I might watch The Last Kingdom. But yeah.
I just want to take issue when you claim that you know almost nothing or maybe less than I do, because what I'm sure it's true is that, of course, you know so much that you just need to reconnect with, because you're the daughter of a Swedish mum. And even if she spoke to you in English, there must be an infinite variety of ways in which, when you're in Sweden and when you connect with anything Scandinavian, you're actually connecting with your mother or aspects of your mother.
Yes, I very much feel that I'm connecting with my mother. And, it really feels, funnily enough, I do feel as though Sweden is, even though it's not my mother country, it's my mother's country, and it's my other country, and it's a country I would have grown up in if my parents had, tossed a coin and said, which of our two countries should we live in? So at that level, you're absolutely right. But in terms of kind of facts, I'm not terribly good.
I would say that I was just in Norway. I was in the Arctic Circle skiing, believe it or not. And I hadn't been in Norway for 30 years and haven't spent much time in Scandinavia, but that I saw so many similarities to Switzerland, which is, even though we're having this conversation in London, I think of Switzerland as my home. And I think that Scandinavia has so much to teach the world.
I agree.
And Scandinavia has gotten so many things right. And just very, I don't want to we'll dive into politics at the end of this, but I come from and this is again something that's interesting to talk to somebody who used to write for The Independent, is that I was kind of a hardcore Thatcherite, conservative, free market person. And increasingly what I realize is that the place the world has to go to is the kind of settlement that the Scandinavian countries have, or Switzerland: social democracy, freedom, corporate freedom, but also making sure that everybody's taken care of. And so... Well,
Guy, this is exactly what I hope my next book will be about.
Yeah. Oh, so interesting. I thought you were going to write about doubt, but I wasn't sure.
No.
Sorry.
Very good.
To do that.
No, I got the no on doubt. So.
Is that the first time somebody's joked with you about that book title?
That is the first time.
Yeah. It's like, you could. I was going to come up later. Sort of like, they said there wasn't a market, but they weren't sure. I mean, you could just go on and on about it. So anyway, there's something really interesting there. I want to go into honesty and truthfulness, and I'll share with everyone a fun little incident that happens that includes my CFO, who's Mark Chapman, who's the father of the person who's doing the recording. So he's not on camera, but there's Ben, Mark Chapman's son, sitting here. I hope you don't mind that I've included you. But so I've met Christina, and I know how to edit Wikipedia pages, and so I've looked at her Wikipedia page, and I decide that, her book should be described as a bestseller. So I went in and changed one or two words, and instead of saying her book ... it says best-selling book. And then about 3 or 4 weeks later, I get a call or an email from Mark, and he says, "Guy, did you edit Christina's Wikipedia page?" I'm like, so usually when I do these things, Christine, it's about 3 a.m. in the morning when I can't sleep. And so I have a vague memory, like, yeah, I think I did. Anyway, we went into it. So it turns out, and then we'll hear Christina's side of the story. So it turns out that Christina had noticed that somebody had edited her page, and she'd gone to see that the name of the account editing is called AQUMARI. So she thought it might be associated with me, because the company name's Aquamarine. And so she gets in touch with Mark, who's kind of been in touch with her. And she very diffidently asked the question. And so it gets to me, I'm utterly mortified. But and I changed it back. But I think that we had an interaction where I said, "Christina, it's my view that it's a bestseller, and I can write it in there and it can get edited out." And I was taken aback by your deep commitment to factful honesty, and that many people would say that is puffery, if you like. So many people call their books best-selling books, and they aren't. But you have a different standard that you apply to anything that's associated with you, and I'm just curious about that.
Goodness, I don't know what to say to that. I mean, for me, it's very simple. The book, I think both books were briefly bestsellers in certain Amazon categories, but that is an extremely precise, specific and ephemeral definition of a bestseller. And neither of those books could be described. The first one, actually, as I said, has so far sold considerably better than the second one. I hope the second one will pick up, because I think it's a better book. But for me, it was straightforward. It's not a bestseller, and therefore I didn't feel it should be described as a bestseller. But
over and above that, Christina was willing to risk embarrassing, whatever it was, she took action. I mean, many people would say, well, if some person somewhere out there that I don't know even sure what their identity is wants to describe my book as a bestseller on a Wikipedia page that is not even attributed to me, then I'll be fine with it. And that for me shows an extraordinarily high standard of truthfulness. And I'll bring in my somebody who you'll know from my book, Monish Pabrai, who is the person who introduced me to this book by David Hawkins, which I'll send you a copy of.
Thank you.
And one of the things that Monish has said, and I think he's right, is that to get to sort of 99% truthfulness gets you maybe about half the benefits. And all the rest of the benefits come from being just unequivocally dedicated to 100% truthfulness. And that's what I detected. That's what came out in spades in you. And I would tell you that I think that now I read your writing in a different way, because I know how you handle facts. And I know that if that's the effort you went to on some stupid edit that I did on a Wikipedia page at 3 a.m. in the morning, there's a kind of a capacity to trust what comes out of the words that you attribute to yourself or that are attributed to you, that's pretty special. And I think that it's something that, I don't know, I'm curious to just know where it came from, I guess. Where did that start?
Gosh, I'm quite taken aback, actually. I suppose most people who know me would describe me as straight talking, honest, whatever. But obviously none of us goes around saying the complete truth of what's in our head. You know, you don't say to your boss, I'm really sick of you, you know, or you know, you're looking a bit ragged today or whatever. I don't. So I'm certainly not 100% committed to the truth in that sense. But I suppose I mean, it's, as I said, the Keats thing about beauty and truth, that just feels to me like what I want to live by. And but I suppose it must have come from my parents. I think my parents were, my father actually, more than my mother, they were both honest people, but my father had a kind of degree of honesty and integrity that was at times extremely uncomfortable. I remember, and not great. I mean, I remember once when I was very disabled in my mid-20s with the lupus pains that I got, you know, he wouldn't stop on a double yellow line to pick me up because you are not allowed to stop on a double yellow line. And I remember when we came back from Sweden, he would, you know, queue up to declare the goods we bought from IKEA. You didn't have to declare the goods we bought at IKEA. So in a way, it went to a slightly ridiculous degree on occasion with him. But he just had a very, very strong belief that in the truth, and that's what I was brought up with. And so I just thought that's what you did, really. And I have been naively, in a way, shocked by when I've discovered that people have lied to me. I mean, for example, there was an editor I used to write for, and I realised because of something, I don't want to go into the details or identify the publication, but I realised that she had lied and I couldn't work for her anymore. I just thought, I can't do that, which is a shame because I kind of paid for, you know, it was, I really don't want to go into the details, but it was not ideal that I didn't carry on working with her, but I just didn't feel I could. So for me, and I obviously don't want to set myself up as any kind of, you know, moral, you know, kind of guru or anything, because I'm obviously as deeply flawed as anybody else. But now that everybody talks about their fundamental values, for me, a degree of honesty, that feels pretty non-negotiable.
You know, speaking of and I'm sure some of it comes from your parents and some of it is innate. And one of the things that I think I have enormous respect for your parents for is that it seems, and I'm not sure if it comes out directly, but they basically saw that something was going on with your sister and took the decision to live a very, very different, far less glamorous life, simply on account of this is our daughter and we want to do our level best to help her out.
Mm.
And your father's honesty does come through, I think, in the book, and your mother's for that matter. But there's what if and I feel the same way with my parents. And just before coming on to recording, we were talking a little bit about it. I feel like if I could have a conversation with your father, and go back in time, is I wish that your parents had been brutally open and clear about everything that was going on with your sister. And I think that they were carrying with them the tragedy of a life of your own child that is not what you hoped it would be, but and for very good reasons, because I think it was the zeitgeist. You didn't share that with you carried your cross inside yourself.
Yeah.
And I wish he'd been honest about that.
Oh gosh, Guy, now I want to cry. I really do want to cry. Yeah, I think all of that is absolutely right. I think they couldn't speak with clarity because they didn't have clarity. And also they were just doing what people do in that situation, which is just trying to keep going and trying to hold the family together and hold things together and carry on getting food on the table and being able to pay the mortgage, which is what everyone has to do in these situations. But you are absolutely right that there was a big legacy, I think, for both my brother and me. My brother, who died 4 years ago, very suddenly of a heart attack, he would never acknowledge actually that any of us paid a price. He wouldn't want to do that out of loyalty to Caroline. And by the way, I would like to make it clear that I do not, of course, blame Caroline in any way at all for the effect her illness had on me or on our family. I think she was heroic in many ways. I said in her, when I spoke at her funeral, I said that she was the bravest person I knew, and I think she was the bravest person I knew. And she was a very sweet, kind, good person as well. But when there is a mental illness in the family, there is a price. And I think the siblings in particular, no, not in particular, the parents, everybody pays a price. And I think my parents probably, they didn't know what price I would pay. Maybe it didn't occur to them. What could they do about it anyway? But I think you're right that with what we know now, I mean, the ideal thing would have been to have sat down, as we were talking about earlier, before we were recording, with a family therapist. But that would never have happened. It just would never have happened in that generation. But I think always better out than in.
Yeah, because I have a theory. So I try, and they're probably, Laurie, my wife, is doing a Jungian coaching course. So all these Jungian, so one of the Jungian ideas is the shadow. The shadow is everything we want to forget about. And I sort of try to be conscious about shining a light on my shadow so that my children know where I'm coming from, and they don't have to shadow box, if you like. They can, the less work they have to do uncovering what is, because there's this idea that everybody knows anyway. And you and your brother on a somatic level understood that something was profoundly wrong, but were unable to talk about it. And in an ideal world, a tragedy brings people, it brings you together. So I think that the best example perhaps I have is of, and I think it's not a problem to mention him, is a man called Bill O'Chee. He's an Australian guy, and he has a Down syndrome son. And again, there's this idea that, it's a more limited life, but he celebrates the achievements of his son, and it can unite a family. And your sister was an extraordinary woman. I mean, she was brilliant. And so, and I think that you're absolutely right. And it's not that she inflicted anything on the family. Something happened for reasons that we don't understand that was inflicted on the whole family.
Exactly.
And she was as much a victim. And yes, she was on the front line because it was inside of her. But so one can go on about it. And I feel slightly diffident because I'm kind of diving into your family. And I know the feeling because you talked about your family in your book and how you're open to everybody discussing it, and you may not want to.
No, I am. I'm fine about
Yeah.
it. I am fine about it. The person who was very private about it was my brother.
Yeah.
But, he is dead now, and I tried to respect his privacy in the book. He was a really lovely person, and I miss him a lot. In fact, weirdly, I was talking to a friend last night whose sister died. It's funny, the three of us, former colleagues from The Independent, we've all lost our sisters, and then I lost my brother. And I was saying to her that actually recently it's been hitting me, not hitting me more, but I kind of get this thought in my head. I think he can't be dead. It just can't be true. But that's just a feature of death, I think. But I'm fine to talk about any of this.
Well, to the extent that it's helpful. And so I'm going to dive into something else. So the part for me in your book that is most frustrating is this, and huge sigh of relief, and it's the Guardian review of the book who writes about it the best. So this extraordinary hold that this HTB, Holy Trinity Brompton, a special version of Christianity, seems to have gotten a hold of on you. And there's one point at which you've been offered a dream job. And you don't take it.
No.
On account of those bastards.
I know.
Excuse me.
I know. Absolutely.
And I'm so frustrated. I'm like, Christina, how can you?
Because God told me, Guy, and I was told, and I was used to giving up everything for God. I had, from the age of 14, when I went to this youth club in order to meet boys, and I didn't realise that the youth club was attached to a Baptist church, or if I did, I didn't kind of properly compute that. And then got sucked into going to the church, and then there was a very charismatic preacher, and, I gave my life to the Lord Jesus, and that meant giving up everything you liked. It meant giving up boys. It meant you weren't allowed to have sex. You weren't allowed to go out with anyone unless God wanted you to marry them. It meant giving up on a normal adolescence. It meant everything. You were guilty about everything all the time. And so it wrecked my adolescence, and the net result, although obviously, it's all a complicated mix, was that my face exploded with acne, really severe, debilitating, ghastly acne. And then I got these debilitating pains in my knees and was literally disabled. But yes, so when I had been going off to go and teach at either the University of Arezzo or Viterbo in Italy, and the leader of one of the churches I was involved with told me that God didn't want me to go. And because I didn't know how to hear God's voice, and she was the leader of the church, I thought, well, here we go again. God is, ruining my life, but I have no choice but to obey. And I think probably, again, we could speculate till the cows come home, but I think probably there was such a hefty element of, I think, underlying all of this was guilt that I was well and my sister was ill. I won the global lottery, not the global lottery. I won the lottery in our family and she lost it. And I think because of that, I had this deep sense that I had to pay.
And I would just add to that, a increasingly secular Britain where there was no, there were no other powerful sort of religious or spiritual influences. One of the people in my skiing group in Norway who studied theology made a distinction for me that I cannot believe I had not made for myself up to that point. But the idea of the Reformation, as he described it to me, is that the person is responsible for their own salvation, not the church. And it puts human decisions at the center of it. And I was actually asking him, why Protestant countries are so rich, and it was, and he said, because in the Protestant worldview, Reformed worldview, you're at the center, and so you have to take the decisions that lead to your salvation. I think that what I find so dehumanizing, it's worse than the Catholic Church, because they're sitting there convincing people that they know what God's will for somebody is, and they're actually putting their organization, which they call the church, which is actually just some kind of pyramid scheme for themselves, and they're using people. And I want to go to those people who are telling you that God needs you to do whatever the hell it is, and say, who the hell are you to take this vulnerable person and convince her of anything? You know, I mean, I hope there's one of Dante's circles of hell that is reserved for somebody like that, because it's extraordinarily, it twists the scriptures in a certain way. And I think that, you know, what I want to say to your parents is, you got to, rewind before you got to that age 14. You got to arm her with something.
I know.
And when there was a similar, so I've been in rooms with people speaking in tongues, and I've been,
Have
and I
you
know
really?
there was a mission to the university when I was at university, and it's a very, very powerful movement, and it can grab a hold of you. It's heady stuff, and it feels really, really good to be in that room. Until a Jewish friend of mine, he says, "Oh, it's very simple. I say I'm Jewish, and they leave me alone." And so, you almost want to inoculate people against that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think my parents were pretty horrified, but ultimately, what can you do? You know, you can't lock your child up. And also, they were Christian. They were very moderate Anglicans. My father would never have talked. Well, I would say he would never have talked about his faith. But when we'd have rows, he would say, you know, honor thy parents. You know, he would sort of, not kind of chapter and verse of the Bible, but he had a prayer book on his bedside table. He went to church every Sunday. Yeah. We all did as a family, but when we didn't go as a family, he would get up early and go to an early service. But for him, it was about morality, really. And there was no sense of a God who would kind of get you out of... I mean, very evidently, God was not going to get you out of corners, because they were in this corner with my sister, and God clearly didn't get them out of that corner.
Right. No, this is... I don't know how... In any case, I have huge issues with that, and it relieves me, and everybody who reads your book are like, yes, she's done it, she's freed herself. But boy, you know, I mean, anyway, it just like makes me very, very angry. And I guess where I want to go is, so you call yourself now a humanist.
Yeah, I don't particularly, actually. The Humanist Society, what are they called now? Humanist UK, but when they contacted me, there was something different. I'd written quite a lot in The Independent about sort of vaguely anti-religious stuff, and they said, would you be a patron? And I thought, sure, because I'm very happy to stand for something that believes in a kind of morality that's, you know, not tethered to a religious faith. But I wouldn't go around saying I'm a humanist particularly.
And in part because, you know, I love this idea that, you know, exactly, you know, one's relationship to the infinite, whatever you want to call it, to the godly is a personal choice. And it gets distorted by any words that one uses.
Exactly.
You know, so why would one use a label?
Exactly.
And I find myself saying, well, what on earth should any kind of... I mean, I think that these religions are distorted. The people who kind of started them were all thinking in the right direction. It has to be human-centered. It should never be centered around anything else. But, you know, we see distortions certainly in the Catholic Church around the popes. And now, very sadly, we see horrible distortions in Israel where it's become... religion has been mixed with politics. But... it's a whole interesting area of discussion, and I don't even feel qualified to talk about it. But now I think, and we're not far off the... I didn't know how long this would go. We're at about an hour now. So you don't really go into it in your book, but Christina's told me I can ask. And so I have this idea that, you know, many decisions you took were taken out of a feeling of guilt that you'd won the lottery and somebody else had lost the lottery. But then, you know, various different kinds of therapy, psychotherapy, were clearly very helpful to you. And I find myself wanting to find out exactly what, how, where, when.
Yes, I wish I could tell you, actually, because I don't... There remains a sort of strong element of mystery for me as well. In my 20s, I saw, when I was in a very bad way, and had this kind of immobilizing physical illness, which was diagnosed as lupus, but later blood tests, in later years didn't show anything. So it was all a bit of a mystery. A very enlightened GP referred me to a psychotherapist, and I subsequently discovered that was paid for by a charity called the Cripplegate Foundation. I was living at the Barbican at the time, and I did think, where is this largesse from the NHS that I can see a therapist twice a week? I think I saw her 3 times a week for a while. And it was psychodynamic psychotherapy. I didn't know anything about it. I knew pretty much nothing about Freud. I found it a huge culture shock. But I think that, again, we can't do controlled experiments, but in seeing this woman, Mrs. Jones, for some years, twice and then 3 times a week, and then twice a week and then once a week, I got better. I got my mobility back. I kind of got stronger. And I think probably I would still have that debilitating physical condition now if I hadn't seen her. And then, all I can say that was a process of psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is, essentially the talking cure, with particular questions asked in a particular way. And I think there was an uncovering for me of family dynamics that was extremely uncomfortable. And this discovery of the complexity of my feelings, conscious and unconscious, about my sister, which was very difficult and painful. And my mother, I have to say, had no truck ever with any of my therapy. And I think I don't blame her for that. I think she was just of a generation that didn't like the idea, and not a generation, because some people obviously did. But I think also partly for her own model of coping was just kind of keep going, keep a lid on things, because if you take the lid off things, everything's going to explode. And of course, when you take the lid off things, they do kind of explode. It's quite messy. But I'm very, very grateful to have had that therapy at that point in my life. And then the other point that I had therapy that was pretty life-changing was when I got breast cancer for the second time in my 40s. And I just thought, I can't do this. I'd just been dumped by somebody I was in love with. And I thought, I can't do this. I just can't go through this. I felt like everything that made me a woman was kind of being chopped off. It was just appalling. And I was seeing an acupuncturist who said, you need to see Richard, the therapist I saw for 3 years, a Jungian analyst who had been a psychiatrist in the NHS. And I saw him for 3 years, and I'm absolutely sure I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be the person I am now. I wouldn't be well and happy and solid in the way I am now, in as far as we are ever any of these things. And I'm also absolutely sure I wouldn't have the relationship I have now if I hadn't seen him.
And, I'll tell you briefly, so Christina hasn't heard this, but the way I got connected to Jungian therapy is that I'm with a Dutch friend of mine and his either wife or fiance, and with their parents, both of which are Jungian therapists. And it's the day that Diana's died. We're on Long Island. And I've got my bleeding heart hanging out for Diana. And Priscilla's mother says, I can't believe you have all these ridiculous feelings for this woman. She uses some terms. One of them that I remember is passive aggressive, and she has a very different view of Princess Diana than the popular press. This is terrible thing that's happened. And I was really curious. I said, that's fascinating. I've never heard that perspective before. Tell me more. And she gave me a book to read, which was, it's the, and I should be better at remembering it, but it's The Myth of the Fisher King. And I'm going to stop there but after I read this book, I started having dreams. I started remembering my dreams. And so now I was curious, and I went into 10 years of Jungian therapy with a man called Soren, who was Swedish.
You write about this in your book, and I found that absolutely fascinating.
And so I would tell you that there's a book by somebody, I think it's called Babette Rothschild, The Body Knows. And this
The body knows the score. No.
Yes, probably some.
Something Van Bessel, somebody Van Bessel, or is this another one? Anyway, I do believe the body knows, but how interesting.
Right, and so this, again, you're very clear that we can't do scientific proofs, but there seems to be something going on there, and we know that you in witch doctors can make somebody believe that they're going to die, and then they die, and there's something going on here which is really fascinating. And I think my point is that I was telling Christina beforehand that my family is God's gift to therapy. We have at least 3 or 4 therapists going on at one time. The more you talk about it, the more people will drop their resistance to being open to that. And there's something weird that once the light is shone, the brain kind of figures it out on its own. And what's fascinating here is that you're a reflective person and you're not afraid of saying, but clearly, and in a certain way, my frustration with it not being written in the book has been alleviated because the processes by which it happened are not fully conscious to you, it seems.
They're not. And I felt that, I mean, also you'd have to write a kind of, 10-volume, kind of account of, I think probably, there is literally nothing less interesting for most people than one's own experience of therapy, unless you're Woody Allen, and obviously we can't even talk about Woody Allen these days. But I think it is about those layers of the onion that you are almost not conscious of being peeled off. And I felt that what happened was a process that felt like a kind of alchemy. I felt that something changed inside that meant that what ended up was different to what had been there before. I'm not saying it was gold, but something I felt as though after that later therapy with Richard, I shifted from somebody whose body was a kind of unexploded bomb walking around waiting for things to happen to it because my body was how I expressed my distress, to having a solidity that I had never had. And I have basically been fine and well since then.
It's really, I find it fascinating. So one of the things that I went and did really out of curiosity was that, so I was hazed in boarding school and all sorts of things that I think were impacting me and my capacity to take decisions, especially decisions that would make me unpopular. And one of the therapies, because New York is God's gift to therapy, I mean, it's just wonderful. And so EMDR.
Oh, yes,
eye movement,
I've had that.
And it's again, the processes, exactly what happens is not clear, but it clearly works. And the movie that comes up for me, just to mention, is an old movie called Prince of Tides, I believe. It's got Barbara Streisand and a man whose name escapes me, but there's this moment in the movie where the man finally takes out this horrific thing that happened to him and his family. And after that, he's able to put his life together and he's able to live the life he'd always wanted to live. And when I brought this up to Soren, my therapist, he poo-pooed it because he said, "Oh, that movie's awful. It makes a dog's ear of what therapy is really about." But I think to the popular mind, it's really great. And I'm just curious. So I'm a big fan of any kind of therapy, and so I go for rolfing from time to time.
Never done that.
And rolfing is at once a kind of a myofascial massage for anybody who's interested, but there's a spiritual or psychological side to it in which, supposedly trauma of one kind or another are embedded in our myofascial system, and that as you work out the kinks, you're actually releasing trauma in a certain way. And the guy that I visit in Zurich has told me to try Reiki.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's a similar kind of idea. And I think you bring up Reiki in the book.
Yeah, I did do Reiki. I went on a holistic holiday on a Greek island called Skiros some years ago, and I went to do writing, and then I didn't do writing. I ended up doing Reiki instead. And I mean, I have to say, if you read up about the kind of birth of Reiki, it does all sound extremely far-fetched. So I wouldn't say, here is a scientific system that we should definitely follow instead of medicine or anything like that. And I haven't had any experience of Reiki for many, many years now, but my experience of it as a receiving Reiki was that it was very powerful. And even more weirdly, having had this kind of training in it, I did find that, I came back and a friend with repetitive strain injury, I had a go on her hand and the repetitive strain injury went, and somebody's knee. I mean, I haven't done it for years and I have no idea, literally no idea how that process could happen. And I haven't gone around saying I'm a healer because I'm clearly not a healer. But all I would say is, what comes up in Hamlet, there is more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. I don't understand how these things sometimes work, but they sometimes do.
And we, for anybody who's curious, science-based medicine is what is scientifically proven, and we need to be wary of alternative medicine and another very derogatory word, quackery. But we can live with both, and we need to be aware that science-based medicine is wonderful and probably where we should always go to first. But we can go to the other things, provided it's clear we're not doing any harm, and they may benefit. So in any case, that's a whole rabbit hole that we could go down. I want to ask you about your craft. I have enormous respect. I feel like I'm a civilian in the writing world. You're a professional.
No, you're a very good writer, actually, Guy.
It's
I'm
very
not saying
kind.
that, you are.
Well, just to be clear, the book was enormously edited and rewritten by William Green, and I had a previous collaborator called Jessa Gamble. What's my point?
Your point is that you don't want to accept the compliment I've just given you, and I've read other writing you've written, which I don't think you have had any help with, and I still think you have a very strong voice.
That's very kind, but I still consider myself a civilian, if only because I have not done the 10,000 hours that would make me perhaps into a professional, because I did dedicate my time to thinking about how to make rich people richer or something like that. I'm curious, and this is so much fun to do this conversation. Can you, writing is without a doubt for me intellectually the most difficult thing that I could possibly do, worse than solving math problems or looking at chess problems.
Wow.
And I'm just curious, I know that as a book reviewer, you would get a book and you would have to read it and then write a review within a week. And I'm curious to hear how you do that and what the most difficult parts are, how you conquer procrastination, how you get to the final product, all of those good things.
Well, the best way to conquer procrastination is you have a deadline, you just have to meet it. So ultimately you don't have any choice about it, you just have to do it. But obviously as a journalist I leave everything to the last minute. So I've just finished writing a review this morning before I came out, actually. And that was due in tomorrow. In fact, I got an email from the literary editor this morning saying, oh, don't worry, it can be next week. And I'm thinking, oh no, I've just done it this weekend. But it doesn't matter. I had to do it anyway. Do you know, I've been doing book reviews for more than 30 years and I still don't find them particularly easy. But I have a ridiculous process where I read the book and I make notes as I read it and underline things. And then I go through this process, which is probably unnecessary, but I've developed it as part of a process and I can't really drop it, is I then go through the book again and I make notes. So I make 4 or 5 pages of notes, often just copying out quotes with kind of scribbled comments. And then I have to condense those 5, 6 pages, whatever, into whatever the word length is, which could be 1,000 words. The one I've just done is 700 words. And I always find starting quite agonizing, even after all these years. But I don't find it easy. I mean, I've been doing it for a long time and I don't find it easy. I find some writing much easier than other things, but I don't think starting is ever easy.
I guess 700 words, condensing down. And, it's funny. So I've realized that the right way to do a podcast is to use a book. Oh, there we are, camera. As a reason, and I've learned not to try and do podcasts with people who haven't written something, But so I wrote, and I'd promised Christina that I'd write it. I want to write a review, at least for myself, of every book that I use as a subject for a podcast. And so while I come across the review by, I don't remember his name, but the man who writes for The Guardian. The book was reviewed
Well,
in The Guardian.
both have Guardian in them. One was by Alex Preston for The Observer, and one was Blake Morrison. And funnily enough, he wrote a memoir that was very significant in the 90s called "And When Did You Last See Your Father?" And I'm actually chairing an event in a couple of weeks with him in Tunbridge Wells at the Literary Festival for his memoir, but he reviewed mine in The Observer.
So I'm sort of like, so Blake Morrison's review it gave me enormous respect for the work of a reviewer, because he nailed so many things. And I'm like sort of struggling with this, I don't know, it's like 1,500 words. And then I'm reading Blake's review and I'm like, he's freaking nailed this. There's nothing else to write after this. It's like really amazing. And to do that regularly, and because I can imagine that many of the books that you review, you don't have a particular connection to them. You don't get particularly excited about them. You just have to write something that's interesting for the reader. And, you've just talked about writing notes and condensing, but still.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the job, isn't it? Any job. And the thing about journalism is that your chief job in anything you write, in my view, of course it is to be factually correct, but is to be entertaining. It's there for a reader to enjoy. And as a critic, I feel a very strong sense of responsibility. I think it's very easy to make mincemeat of someone's work, but it's agonizing. A book takes years to write, or, at least months. And so I'm very careful, and I don't admire critics who are too cavalier in their criticism. And, it's obviously not brain surgery or, to use the cliche, rocket science. But not much work is easy, is it? I mean, all work is difficult in different ways.
That's something that, today most of us don't want to accept. Work is supposed to be easy. But here, just to go into the mechanics, I think this is just a selfish question, I guess. I think one can distinguish between, I think somebody like me sits in front of a blank piece of paper and is waiting for a flash of insight. And I think that what I've learned, to the extent that I can do it, is to have some kind of mechanical process that I go through, because the flashes of insight will come not from staring at a blank piece of paper.
Exactly.
But, so what is the mechanical process is to just underline?
I think it's probably, I don't know what other people do, and I think my process is sort of tortuous and long and I'm sure unnecessary, really, but it's just what I've developed, and therefore it's what I do. I think, there's a book I wrote, I bought, which I haven't read, but the title is First Write a Sentence, and probably that's the thing to do, just write a sentence and see what happens. But we all need a kind of scaffolding of a kind, and I've been asked over the years sometimes, how do you structure a column or a feature or an interview? And I never studied journalism, so nobody ever taught me how to structure anything, and I don't know how I do it, but if I were to sit and study something I wrote, any of those things, then I would realise there would be a structure, and somehow you learn these things almost unconsciously and kind of internalise it, which is how we learn many, if not most things in life. It's how we learn to walk, it's how we learn to speak, it's how we learn to do any job. A lot of it is instinctive, but until it becomes instinctive, I suppose there is a process we develop. And it might well have been helpful if I had studied journalism, but I didn't. So I did other things first. But the most important thing was to read, and you read masses. And that's, if you want to write, you just have to read.
Well, and I think that in the self-helpish kind of way, I'm like asking for the one thing that nails it. And your answer is just spend a lot of time at the rock face and eventually it will come. Yeah. But it's not going to happen because you give some simple key. Funnily enough.
But you already do it, Guy. You don't need me to tell you how to do it.
Thank you. I don't do it enough, but and I do ask myself if I'd spent more time writing. I never valued writing until actually I would say that it was so one of the reasons why I can sit here and have enormous respect for you as a non-writer, and I still believe I'm a non-writer, is I worked very, very closely with William Green, and I've said this elsewhere, but so we would take it chapter by chapter, we would review the whole chapter, and the way William would describe it is that it was a suit, but in my suit the trousers were coming out of the arm sleeves, and the and because I didn't have a sense of structure, I didn't have a sense of beginning and end and payoff, and so William would rewrite what I had written. And as we were getting close to the point where we could no longer review and he had to go into a rewriting mode, I would see his face become grayer and grayer as he felt the burden of what he would have to work through.
Wow.
And I saw what came out the other side, and briefly, Christina, William knows the story well. So once I tried to edit William's work. There's a famous moment where I try to approach his keyboard to write something, and I just see these words: "Step away from the keyboard." This is a guy who's he was an editor for Time in Asia, and he's worked collaboratively with people, so he knows all about this. And then as I'm reading through my edits of what he's written, and he's just sitting there, and I feel my heart sinking as I realize what a pig's ear, I think, is the expression that I've made of it. And I kind of say, William, this is a bad idea. Let's just revert to the old version. William sits there and he says, no, we're going to listen to all of this, Guy. And I'm just sort of crumbling in front of him. But anyway, so I have enormous respect for your craft. I realize that I haven't asked you much about poetry. I'm not a native to the world of poetry. I guess let me ask you this. Oh, because you're experienced in the world of poetry where I'm not. And I don't want to leave this conversation without having talked a little bit about it. So I'll pick up books of poetry, and some of the poems I'll connect to, some of them I won't. But I'm not somebody who reads through a whole book of poetry, which the way I think some people do. And then there are poems that I was given as a prize at school, actually, the Oxford Book of Poetry. And I think that in there, under T.S. Eliot, is the love song of Alfred J. Prufrock. And I don't know what half of it means. But what is it about that poem, for example, that is just stuck inside me, and I don't even know what it means?
Yeah. I don't know is the short answer. Many years ago, well, before the millennium, before I worked at The Independent, I was asked to pick my book of the millennium, which obviously when you haven't been alive for most of the millennium is likely to be, fairly recent. And I picked The Wasteland. And I can't tell you why that is a work of genius. I can only say that it is. I think the thing about poetry is that it's, in a way, and I've just read a wonderful collection by a friend of mine who's a poet, Maura Dooley, called The 555. I don't read much poetry these days. I wish I did, and I have a whole wall of poetry at home. I suppose, like everybody, I've caught up with the reading I have to do for work, and then with the news cycle and, and my phone, scrolling through my phone and all the rest of it. I think the thing about poetry is that it's kind of the purest of the literary art forms, and at its best, it gets to the heart of things. And it can do that through a way that feels almost magical. In Eliot's case, I would say some of it does feel magical because we don't actually know what some of it means. But you don't have to. It somehow, it hits you in the heart, and you can have those words floating around in your head like a half-remembered song, and you don't need to know what it means. I have no idea how he did that, and not all or even much poetry is as obscure, to use a kind of, a word you might use about it, as Eliot. But I do know that good poetry is a very pure art that it's very hard to master. Yeah. I can't do it.
Yeah, but you clearly appreciate it enormously, and you've met all of these people. So I want to. So tell us about what you're up to now, and what your life is full of.
Well, my life is full of joy, actually. I don't work nearly as hard as I used to. I've worked extremely hard most of my adult life, and that was fine in lots of ways. But there are other things in life, apparently, and I've discovered some of those other things in life. I've trained as a coach, and I love coaching, so I spend quite a lot of my time coaching now. Strangely, I've ended up doing quite a lot in the VC incubator space, so I've been coaching youngish, or people of different ages, starting businesses in the sustainability area, which I love. I'm also doing a course in somatic coaching for the reasons we've discussed, and I'm finding that fascinating. I still review for the Sunday Times. I still do my press preview. I look at the front pages on Sky News. I've recently written pieces for the Sunday Times Magazine, the Observer Magazine, the Telegraph, the Mail. So I do some journalism, some broadcasting, some coaching, and what I'm hoping to get my teeth into next is my book project that I talked about earlier, touched on, which I hope will be about Sweden and some of the issues we discussed about the kind of social democratic model of the good society and what we can learn from that. But it's really early stages, and I haven't done anything really with that yet. So that's what I'm kind of working on at the moment.
Somatic coaching, what is that?
It's about using the body in coaching, listening to the body. So it's what we talked about, as we've both discussed and learnt. The body is where we carry a lot of our experiences, our feelings, our memories, our traumas, our day-to-day responses and our habits. And coaching is about helping people to make changes in their life through becoming a thinking partner with them. And obviously a lot of that goes on here, but a lot of it goes on here. And if we're not in touch with what goes on here, then it's quite hard to make changes, particularly deep habitual changes. So I'm just in the first couple of months of doing this course, and it's just, a night a week. But it's fascinating, really fascinating.
I am heartened by the idea that you're coaching entrepreneurs, and you should know that a very long time ago, I did a 1-week course at MIT on literature and business.
Oh, wow.
And I don't remember what the contents were, but we had to read all sorts of stories, and they were discussed in a business context. And the idea that stories are divorced from business, of course, is ridiculous. And, there's a hero of mine is the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, this man, Charlie Munger. And when he was asked a question at one of the annual meetings whether he read fiction, he said that he was kind of done with fiction. And that really irked me because there's another man called Tyler Cowen who's a professor. He's got a wonderful podcast. And he's got a wonderful goal in life of teaching as many people economics as possible. And he's written an article about literature stories being a sort of a laboratory for economics. So, we see in the economics journals a lot of articles where you get data from the real world, but actually it's fiction that has survived, stories that have survived may contain a certain kind of data that is worth studying. And I've got, as a mini project of mine, to read all sorts of, well, in German it would be called
Bildungsrahmen, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there's an enormous amount of wisdom that one can get out of that. So tell me about so I want to hear about, if you follow Christine on Twitter, she'll announce, and it doesn't work very well for me when I'm in Switzerland because it happens at 12 p.m., but you'll go on TV at 11 o'clock at night and discuss the next morning's papers.
Yeah, well, I've been doing that for maybe 15 years or something, mostly every other Saturday. And so, of course, it used to be in a studio, but since the pandemic, we do it from home, which is not nearly as much fun. But you get the pages kind of break just before you go on air now. So we used to obviously get them printed out in the actual studio. They'd be sent through by the newspapers. And now we just get them sent through on our phones. And some of them will come on through while you're on air. So you just literally 5 minutes before you go on, you discuss which pages and stories you'll be talking about. And so I do that at 10:30 on a Saturday night and then at 11:30. And it's the next day's front pages and some inside pages.
Stressful or fun?
Fun. I don't find it stressful. I mean, I did at first, but no, it is fun. But it is fun, but it's not nearly as much fun as in the studio. In the studio, you've got the chemistry of being with someone on the sofa, and you can have a laugh. And it's quite hard to have any humour when you're kind of doing it via Zoom, actually.
Yeah.
And I do think, ideally, everything in life should be leavened by a bit of humour, if possible.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to go around when it comes to the daily newspapers.
Yes.
I'm going to finish with some questions that I thought I would start with, but it's actually a great place to finish, which is that I discovered that you like all sorts of things Italian, including big glasses of red wine, especially, along with crisps. So now I can't have crisps and wine and not think of Christina Patterson. How did you discover this particular love?
Well, it wasn't terribly difficult.
Well, it's not gin and tonics. It's not white Chardonnays.
Well, actually, it often is white. It is often is white. And it's also often a Negroni, it has to be said, which is my current favourite non-wine tipple. I just love a really good glass. I mean, it doesn't have to be really good, as in really expensive. It just has to be really delicious glass of wine. And I love the Italian tradition of the aperitivo, which is when you have your pre-dinner drink. And that's really my favourite bit of the day. You sit down with a nibble or two, very often crisps. You introduced me, Guy, to truffle crisps, and I have to say they are absolutely delicious. But if you're in Italy and you go to a bar, they will lay out a tray of, on the bar, there will be the aperitivo nibbles, which might be, a bit of bruschetta or some crisps or whatever. And I just, every day around sort of, when the sun is going near the yardam, I feel this kind of itch on my tongue and I think, time for a nice glass of wine. And I just love it. It makes me very happy.
Well, so we've been living as a family in Switzerland for 14 years, it turns out. I don't know where the time went. It goes by so fast. But one of the things I tell people about Zurich is I say one of the things I learned from living in Zurich is that I love Italy. And it's that Zurich is the Germanic part of the world, so there's butter and sausages and all things meats. And when you get to Italy, you've got all olive oil, and you've got a whole different kind of food. And the only ethnic food that is done well in Zurich is Italian food. Oh. If you want, Korean, Japanese, Thai, it's very impoverished. London's far, far better for that. And so I've developed a kind of a love for Italy just through the proximity in Switzerland.
How interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I adore, as you know, I was born in Italy, but I adore Italy. We have a house in Umbria. I had for 15 years a little flat in Tuscany. And I just go there and I just feel happy. Open a lovely bottle of wine, look at a beautiful view. What's not to like? Yeah,
exactly. And so I think what we're going to miss out, we're going to stop there. What we're going to miss out is drawing you on, earlier on when you were talking about truthfulness and you said, well, it's easy. Well, I wanted to talk about a former blonde prime minister who really has a lot of difficulty with truthfulness. And so we're not going to go there, and we're not going to go. One of the things that Christina's told me is that she feels politically homeless in the UK. And I think I would say the same thing, but such a pleasure. Follow her on Twitter, go to her blog. She's in the papers the whole time. She's on TV the whole time. Wonderful lady. And of course, buy her book. It's a wonderful book. Should be on everybody's bookshelf. Very, very special. And difficult to read because there's an enormous amount of pain that she works through. So, but thank you for coming. I'll give you the last word.
Well, I mean, I have to sort of eradicate most of that conclusion because I'm not on TV all the time. I'm not in the papers all the time. And I'm, very minor British journalist. But it has been an absolute honour and pleasure to talk to you today, Guy. Thank you for your wonderful questions and your fascinating conversation.
Thank you.